Okay, the gentleman who you've just seen in the title picture is Akiba Rubenstein, who was an incredible chess player. He played chess in the late part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s, and had two very distinct aspects to his game. He was brilliant at chess combinations, that is, deep series of moves to win material in the middle game, and he had a very strong understanding of endgame play as well, which made him a very difficult person to play against, because if he didn't find a combination to win a piece off you and win the game, he'd use his combinational power to go into a one endgame. Today's topic is passed pawns, and this is a demonstration by Rubenstein of the power of passed pawns. Philidor, who was a world champion of chess in the 1700s, said that the pawns are the soul of chess, and this game illustrates why. So Rubenstein was playing white, and he was playing a player called Duras, and the game was played in Vienna in 1908. So the game starts off with queen pawn opening. Knight comes out, c5, attacking the center, and Rubenstein defends the pawn. Knight f6, developing a piece, and now the pawn is captured by Rubenstein. Black plays queen a5 check. This is bringing the queen out a little bit too early. Probably a better move instead of queen a5 check is to play e6, which then exposes the pawn to attack and keeps control of the center. But in the game, queen a5 is what was played, checking the king and attacking the pawn at the same time. So we've got a little queen fork there. Rubenstein played his knight to d2, and queen took the pawn. a3 by white, looking to attack the queen and gain space with his pawns. So his next move, or threatening his next move, is to attack the queen with a gain of space. And so Duras, who'd brought his queen out too early, decided to bring it back to somewhere sensible before that move was played. And now white attacks the center, and black takes the pawn. Probably a better move than taking the pawn is to play e6, and that way you can maintain a pawn in the center. If this pawn, the c pawn, takes here, then you recapture and you've still got a central pawn. However, the pawn was captured by Duras. The knight took back, and Duras develops his bishop to a square where it's pinning the knight to the queen. Rubenstein plays b4 anyway and gains space on the queen side, and Duras continues to develop his back row pieces towards the center of the board. And bishop b2. I like this square for the bishop. It's a nice open diagonal and attacking central square, so a very powerful bishop. Good square for the bishop. b5 by Duras. So he's attacking the knight, trying to make it move away. And in this position here, Rubenstein shows you his incredible combinational genius, basically. This is very complex, the next little section of this game, and if you want to go through it in detail, by all means do. The point of today's lesson is not this combination, it's the strategic idea of passed pawns. So we will sort of skip over this a bit. We're not really going to do this part of the game justice. It is very, very complicated what happens next. So the pawn is attacking the knight, and most players will just retreat that knight to d2. But Rubenstein played his knight up to e5. And this looks like a mistake, because the defender of the knight is pinned. There's a pin here. So it looks like this knight has been basically given up. You've got one defender here and another defender here, but you've got one attacker here and two attackers here. Since this defender is pinned, it's not supposed to be able to help defend. And so black thought that white had given up material, that he'd just made a mistake and hadn't realized that one of the knights was pinned. So he plays knight takes e5, and then in this position Rubenstein plays knight takes. Now, as I say, this is complex and requires a lot of analysis, but it's a brilliant piece of play. And knight takes e5. Bishop immediately grabbed the queen, as you would, and bishop takes b5 check. So the fact that the king is exposed is what allows this combination to happen. So bishop takes b5 check, attacking the king, and black blocks with knight d7, and then bishop takes at d7 with check. Now, it's still quite a complicated position, and Duras thought a long time and realized that his best move was to recapture with the queen. And then the knight took, and Duras got his bishop out of there. And then the knight comes back to e5. So after all that, after all those fireworks, well, what's really happened on the board? If both players have two minor pieces and two rooks, and all that's really happened is that Rubenstein, through this massive combination, very complex, has won one pawn. So he has an extra pawn on the queen side. But on the queen side of the board, he's got two pawns versus one pawn. And the topic today is passed pawns. A passed pawn is a pawn that can't be stopped by another pawn from getting to the end of the board, from getting to a queening square. So there's no passed pawns on the board as yet, but the B pawn for white, this pawn here, is the best candidate for a passed pawn. So he has what's called a pawn majority on the queen side, Rubenstein. He's got 2 versus 1, and the point of the combination was to go into a winning endgame. We're not quite to the endgame yet, but Rubenstein could see how he'd move towards one endgame here. The only advantage that black really has over white at the moment is he's got two bishops versus a bishop and a knight on a fairly open board, but that's a pretty slim advantage when compared to a pawn and a powerful pawn majority on the queen side. So Duras kept developing his pieces. That's the right square for a rook. This is an open file. A file with no pawns is where a rook belongs, and so he's activating his rook there. G4 by Rubenstein is inspired stuff. He's attacking the bishop, and now the bishop has to run away, and he gets the bishops off the board. Gets the bishop off the board for a knight. So now it's one bishop each, and this improves his advantage. H takes is a good move, because now you keep all your pawns on the queen side together in one group, and you exert some pressure with your other rook. So Duras's pieces are fairly strong at the moment, and Rubenstein develops his bishop to the center of the board and attacks this weakling pawn. When someone has a pawn that's on its own, an isolated pawn, you should attack it. This forces your opponent to defend with pieces or move the pawn, and by playing that move he's activated his bishop to one of the strongest squares on the board and forcing black to do something defensive with his move. So he has to move the pawn to a6. And now a very good move by Rubenstein, king up to d2. Rubenstein can see that his king's quite safe there, and unlike a middle game where a king has to be tucked away safely, in the endgame the king must be used as an attacking piece. And at d2, the king helps to defend these squares. And so it stops this rook from coming down the board and invading the white pawn structure. And it also means that the white rooks are now connected. They're now connected to each other. The king's not in the way, and they can come here and challenge this rook's control of the c file. So a good play by Rubenstein there. f6, looking to move the pawns into the center and weaken this bishop. Now rook ac1. It's a very good move, challenging control of the open file. Rook takes, and now white is a very good rook. The black pieces, when white plays this rook capture move, he gives up a pawn over here, but it's much better to have a powerful rook than to worry about this pawn over here. These two pawns here are much more important than this pawn over here. And so what this game is now about, because it's an endgame, is who can get a queen first by moving a pawn all the way up the board. Rubenstein's identified that he's got a much better chance and will be able to queen more quickly on the queen side with the A and the B pawn than Duras will over on the king side. So even if he loses the H pawn, these pawns are a long way from creating a queen, whereas these guys are on the march, as you'll see. So Rubenstein gives up the pawn over here in order to have an active rook. E5 by black, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes over to C5, and the rook snaps off the pawn. Bishop took at F8. The king took. And now, of course, white has to defend this pawn. Moves his king across. E4 by black. And rook up to C6. So once again, the rook attacks this weak pawn over here. This time around it's helpless, it can't be saved. And so even when Rubenstein moved his rook across from H1 to C1, he realised he'd be able to gain this pawn anyway because of the active rook. So he wasn't too fussed. Rook across to G2 now, looking to attack the G pawn for white. Rook takes and rook takes. Now even though the material's even, white's advantage is huge. What he's got over here now is two passed pawns. There's no pawns between these pawns and getting to the end, so they're called passed pawns. The first step in promoting to a queen is to create a passed pawn, and then you push that passed pawn up the board. And these are even stronger because these are called connected passed pawns. That means they help defend each other. And connected passed pawns are a very, very powerful asset in a chess game, as you'll soon see. So even though material's even, Duras could just about resign in this position. Rook up to A7 is a good move. What it does, it attacks the pawn, but it also cuts the king off from the rest of the board. This king is active and can move up the board. This king is blocked from the rest of the board. And so black has effectively one less attacker in the game, one less piece. Rook down to G1. So black's looking to get his rook over to the queen side to try and stop these pawns from marching up the board and becoming queens. So he's looking to get his rook across to help out with the defences. And there's a saying in chess, passed pawns must be pushed. I believe it was Nimzovich that coined that phrase, but it's a very common expression. Passed pawns must be pushed, and here they go. Rubenstein pushes his passed pawn. Rook gets behind it, and here's where the connected part helps. The pawn moves to A4, helping to defend. And black's really got no good plan here. All he can do is try to force his own queen, but clearly he's not going to be able to do it before white gets to the other end of the board with his pawns. Okay, so G5 was played, and then rook to B7, defending the pawn, or actually preparing to move the A pawn. Rook A1 behind this one. And in this position, Rubenstein had a bit of a think about it. And now the concept of time comes into the equation. If you can get a queen by promoting a pawn, it doesn't really matter if you give up one or two pawns or even a piece to do it, because a queen is worth 9 pawns. And so if you give up 2 pawns or a piece, that's only 2 or 3 points. You're still going to gain a massive advantage by getting a pawn to the other end. And Rubenstein could see how he could promote the B pawn. And so he sacrifices the A pawn. He plays B6. The rook takes the A pawn, and now the winning move, rook A7. Now in this position, if black plays rook takes rook, then of course pawn takes, and we get ourselves a queen and an easy win. So there's no way that Duras can swap rooks, just to keep his rook on the board, and plays it to B4. And the passed pawn gets pushed. It's on its way to becoming a queen. And it's a pretty tough spot now for Duras. No matter what he does, the pawn will promote with check. So he plays g4, and the rook goes down with check. This is a common theme, to give a rook down with check to be able to protect the queening square with the rook. So because it's a check, the play works. King gets out of the way, and there's your queen. Duras, of course, can't leave the queen on the board, and now white is winning by a whole rook. He's a couple of pawns behind, but his king's in the area of those pawns, and with an extra rook, this is an easy win from here. Black activates his king. White starts to give checks and starts to use his rook, but keeps activating his king. And in this position, Duras actually gave up. And that's because the white king is in the right area to help defend, as is the rook. So there's no way he'll promote a pawn. If you're at all unsure as to why he resigned, play this position out with a friend a few times. Just take turns being black or white. And after 2 or 3 goes at it, you'll start to understand that this is a very, very easy win for white. When you've only got a king and pawns left, eventually you run out of playable moves and you have to give up points. The key idea in this game was the use of the passed pawns, connected passed pawns by Rubenstein. There was a very deep combination played, and if you're interested in middle game play, certainly study all the variations of that position. But the point of the game is that passed pawns are a very powerful asset in a game of chess, particularly if you can play a combination to swap pieces off the board. The more pieces that are off the board, the more a passed pawn is a valuable asset. And so Rubenstein shows us how you can go from the middle game and move into a one-end game. So if you understand the power of a passed pawn, you can win a lot of games very decisively. So good luck with your games and push those passed pawns.